A janitor's daughter had hours to live when Marilyn made a life-or-death decision. The golden pocket watch hummed against my palm, a tiny, brass heart beating with the rhythm of a lifetime I thought had been tucked away in the attic of my memory. It was just a heavy piece of metal until I pressed the latch, and the scent of lavender and old cedar wood drifted up, carrying the ghost of a woman who had been my North Star for 50 years. The house was too quiet now, the kind of silence that has a weight to it, pressing against your chest until it is hard to draw a full breath. I sat in the velvet armchair, the one with the frayed edges where she used to rest her hand while she read to me. Outside, the autumn leaves were performing their final, frantic dance against the window pane, a mosaic of burnt orange and deep crimson that blurred through the tears I had promised myself I would not shed today. I looked down at the photograph tucked inside the watch's casing. It was black and white, faded at the corners, showing a young girl standing on a pier with the wind catching her hair. She looked as though she were about to fly, her eyes filled with a kind of hope that the world had not yet dared to touch. That was the summer of 1952, the year the world felt wide and infinite. We were just children of the tide, promising forever before we even understood what a day truly cost. I remembered the way her fingers felt, trembling as she pressed this very watch into my hand the night I left for the coast. She told me that as long as the gears turned, her heart would find its way back to mine, no matter how many miles of ocean lay between us. But the gears had stopped long ago, jammed by a speck of sand or perhaps the sheer exhaustion of keeping time for a man who was lost. I had spent 40 years believing the mechanism was broken beyond repair, a metaphor for the way my own spirit felt after she passed away peacefully in her sleep last spring. I had taken it to every jeweler in the county, and they all shook their heads, claiming the internal springs had surrendered to the rust of grief. Tonight, however, the air felt different, charged with a strange, electric warmth. I held the watch tight, whispering her name into the shadows of the parlor, a desperate plea for one more moment of her light. Suddenly, a sharp, crystalline chime echoed through the room, a sound so pure it felt like a physical touch. The second hand, frozen for 4 decades, gave a sudden, violent shudder. It moved once, then twice, and then began a steady, rhythmic sweep across the face. The silence of the house was shattered by the frantic, beautiful ticking of a promise kept from beyond the veil. My heart fractured in my chest as the realization washed over me. She wasn't just a memory kept in a locket, she was still here, moving the very fabric of time just to tell me she hadn't left me behind. If these stories of enduring connection resonate with you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more explorations of the human spirit. The rhythmic ticking grew louder, matching the frantic pulse in my throat as the room began to glow with a soft, impossible light. I realized then that the watch hadn't been waiting for a craftsman's tool, but for the one thing I had been too afraid to offer until this very moment. The scent of scorched lavender always lingered in the corners of the parlor, a ghostly perfume that refused to fade even as the decades turned the wallpaper to the color of bruised tea leaves. It was the smell of a house holding its breath, waiting for a footfall that had long ago vanished into the mist of the valley. Every evening, Martha would sit by the window and watch the sun dip behind the jagged peaks, feeling the weight of the silver locket against her chest, a cold reminder of the secret she had carried through the winter of her life. She remembered the way the light used to dance on Thomas's hair when they were young and the world felt infinite, before the shadows grew long and the silence became her only companion. They had built this life out of grit and whispered promises, carving a home from the stubborn earth, but the foundation was laid on a truth too heavy for one person to bear. The problem wasn't the isolation or the failing harvest, it was the letter hidden beneath the loose floorboard in the pantry, its ink fading like the memories of his laughter. It was a confession written in a fever of regret, a plea for forgiveness that she had never been able to grant because the words felt like thorns in her throat. She had spent 40 years tending to the garden of his absence, pulling the weeds of bitterness while the roses of her youth withered into dust, wondering if the grace she sought was laid to rest with him or if it was still beating inside her own tired heart. One Tuesday, when the rain hammered against the glass like a desperate heartbeat, a young man appeared at her gate. his shoulders hunched against the gale and his eyes mirroring a sky she hadn't seen in a lifetime. He held a tattered map and a photograph that made the room spin, his voice trembling as he asked if this was the place where the stories began. As Martha looked at his weathered hands, she saw the same crescent-shaped scar on his thumb that Thomas had earned during that first summer of clearing the brush, and the breath left her lungs in a jagged sob. The payoff of her long, lonely vigil arrived not in words, but in the recognition of a lineage she thought had been buried in the cemetery. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched the boy's cheek, feeling the warmth of a legacy that had survived the frost of her resentment. The walls of the house seemed to exhale at last, the scorched lavender scent giving way to the fresh, sharp smell of the rain and the promise of a story finally coming full circle. In that moment, the heavy locket felt lighter, as if the burden of the past had finally found its rightful heir. The boy looked at her with a knowing kindness, unaware that he had just unlocked a door she had kept bolted for an eternity. But as he stepped over the threshold, Martha noticed a second shadow lingering by the gate, watching them with eyes that held a far more dangerous truth. The golden pocket watch sat in the palm of my hand, its rhythmic ticking sounding like the steady heartbeat of a ghost. I could almost feel the phantom warmth of my father's fingers on the polished brass, a lingering echo of a man who spent 40 years measuring his life in seconds and minutes. This wasn't just a timepiece, it was a vessel for every unspoken "I love you" that had ever been swallowed by the silence of a busy workshop. I remember the day he gave it to me, his hands trembling with the weight of age and a lifetime of labor. We were sitting on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. He didn't say much, he never did, but the way he pressed that cold metal into my palm told me everything his voice couldn't. It was the inheritance of his soul, a promise that even when the light faded, the gears of our connection would never stop turning. I looked at the intricate carvings on the casing, worn smooth by his thumb, and I realized that every scratch was a story, every dent a memory of a day he worked until his bones ached just to keep a roof over our heads. But now, the ticking had stopped. The silence coming from that small brass circle felt like a cavernous void, a terrifying stillness that suggested the bond was finally breaking. I took it to every specialist in the city, but they all shook their heads, claiming the internal mechanism was too delicate, too far gone to be revived. It felt as if my father was slipping away a second time, leaving me alone in a world that had grown far too quiet. I spent nights at my kitchen table, the lamp casting long, lonely shadows, staring at the motionless hands. I felt a desperate, clawing need to hear that heartbeat again, to know that the craftsmanship of his life hadn't simply ground to a halt. It wasn't about the time, it was about the rhythm of a man who believed that if you cared for something, it would last forever. Then, just as I was ready to tuck it away in a velvet-lined coffin of a drawer, I noticed a tiny, almost invisible engraving hidden behind the winding stem. It was a date, barely legible, followed by a set of coordinates that pointed toward the old clock tower in the center of our village. My breath hitched as I realized this wasn't just a broken heirloom. It was a final message, a breadcrumb trail left by a man who knew his time was short, but his love was infinite. I grabbed my coat, the cold night air biting at my cheeks, and ran toward the towering shadow of the stone belfry. I climbed the narrow, winding stairs, my lungs burning, and my heart thundering against my ribs in a desperate mimicry of the watch's lost pulse. Reaching the summit, I found a small wooden box tucked behind the primary weights of the great clock, covered in decades of dust. With shaking fingers, I pried the lid open, and there, resting on a bed of stained silk, was a single, handcrafted silver gear that looked exactly like the one missing from my father's watch. The moonlight caught the silver teeth of the gear, sparking a glimmer of hope that brought me to my knees in the dust of the tower. I held the tiny piece of metal to my chest, weeping for the man who had planned for my grief long before I even knew it was coming. The velvet curtain of memory often catches on the smallest thorns, like the scent of scorched engine oil or the way the morning light used to fracture against a dusty windshield. It was a Saturday in late October, the kind of day where the air feels like a crisp apple and the shadows stretch long and thin across the gravel driveway. Thomas sat on a low wooden stool, his knuckles scarred by decades of honest labor, staring at the rusted skeleton of the 1965 Mustang that had sat silent for 20 years. To anyone else, it was a heap of oxidizing steel, but to Thomas, it was the vessel that held the ghost of his youth and the echoes of a passing that he still could not quite voice. He picked up a heavy iron wrench, its surface cold and reassuring in his palm, and leaned into the engine bay. Every turn of a bolt felt like a conversation with his father, the man who had taught him that a machine only breaks when you stop listening to its heartbeat. Thomas worked with a frantic, quiet desperation, his breath hitching as he scraped away layers of grime to reveal the glimmer of chrome beneath. He wasn't just fixing a car. He was trying to bridge the vast, silent canyon that had opened up in his soul since his wife had departed 2 winters ago. He could almost hear her laughter over the clatter of the metal tools, reminding him that she always loved the way he smelled of gasoline and old leather. By midday, the sun was high, casting a harsh light on his trembling hands. The problem wasn't the spark plugs or the fuel line. It was the fear that if he finished this, he would have nothing left to hold on to. He reached deep into the manifold, and his fingers brushed against something soft and out of place, a small, weathered leather pouch tucked behind the block. With shaking fingers, he pulled it free and opened the rusted snap. Inside was a handwritten note from his wife, dated the very week they had parked the car for the last time. It read, "For when you are ready to drive toward the light again." The weight of those words hit him like a physical blow, a surge of love so potent it stole the air from his lungs. He collapsed against the fender, the tears finally breaking through the dam he had built around his heart, sobbing for the years lost to silence and the beauty of being known so deeply. He realized then that she hadn't just left him a car. She had left him a map back to his own life. The engine, once a tomb of frozen pistons and rusted dreams, felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. He wiped his eyes with a grease-stained sleeve, a small, fragile smile flickering across his face as he reached for the ignition key. The silence of the garage felt heavy, pregnant with the ghost of a sound that hadn't been heard in a generation. Would the metal remember the fire, or had the spark finally vanished into the shadows of the past? Do you have an heirloom that tells a story? Share your history with us in the comments below. The dusty floorboards of the attic do not just hold crates. They hold the ghosts of every version of ourselves we ever outgrew. There, tucked behind a mountain of moth-eaten blankets, sat the cedar chest, its heavy lid sealed tight by 30 years of silence. It looked less like a piece of furniture and more like a tombstone for a life we had almost forgotten we lived. I remember the day we slid it into that dark corner, promising we would open it when the world felt kinder, but the world has a way of staying cold for a very long time. My fingers trembled as they brushed against the brass latch, cold and stubborn against my skin. It felt like a betrayal to disturb the dust, to wake up the memories that had finally found some peace in the dark. But the heart knows when it is time to face its own history, even if the eyes are afraid of what they might see. When the hinges finally groaned, a sound like a long repressed sigh, the scent of lavender and old paper rushed out to meet me, pulling me back to a Tuesday in 1995. There, resting right on top, was the tiny yellow sweater with the mismatched buttons, the one she wore the day the fever finally broke. I picked it up, and it was so light it felt like holding a handful of clouds. I could almost hear the phantom echo of her toddler-sized laughter bouncing off the rafters. Beneath the sweater lay a stack of letters, tied together with a fraying blue ribbon that had lost its shine but kept its secret. These were the words we wrote to each other when the house was too quiet to speak aloud, back when the weight of our shared loss felt like an anchor dragging us both to the bottom of a dark sea. I pulled a single page from the middle. The ink faded to a ghostly gray. It was a list of dreams we had written down on our 10th anniversary simple things, like owning a porch swing and seeing the redwood forests. We were so young then, so certain that time was a river that only flowed forward towards sunnier banks. I clutched the paper to my chest, the sharp corners poking at my skin, a physical reminder that we survived the storms we thought would surely sink us. The silence of the attic was no longer heavy, it was full, vibrating with the presence of every joy and every loss we had endured together. I realized then that we hadn't been hiding these things away to forget them. We had been keeping them safe until we were strong enough to carry them again. I stayed there for hours, a solitary figure draped in the golden afternoon light that filtered through the grime of the small circular window. The shadows grew long, stretching across the floor like reaching arms as I sorted through the remains of our youth. Each photograph and every pressed flower was a stitch in the quilt of a life well worn and deeply felt. I closed the lid softly, the click of the latch sounding like a period at the end of a very long sentence. I walked toward the stairs, carrying only the small yellow sweater and a renewed sense of who we used to be. But as my foot hit the top step, a flash of white caught my eye from a gap in the floorboards I had never noticed before. The golden pocket watch in my trembling hand felt heavier than a mountain, its rhythmic ticking a heartbeat echoing through the hollow silence of the hallway. For 50 years, that sound had been the steady pulse of a life shared, but tonight it felt like a countdown toward a final, agonizing goodbye. The brass was cold against my palm, a stark contrast to the warmth of the hand that used to hold it while we sat on the porch, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight of our youth. Inside the room, the air was thick with the scent of lavender and the antiseptic tang of a long winter. My Evelyn lay there, her hair like spun silver against the ivory pillow, a fragile ghost of the woman who once spun me across a dance floor until the stars turned dizzy. I remembered the day we bought this watch at a dusty fair in Ohio. We had only $20 to our name, but she insisted that time was the only thing worth spending. Now, time was the one currency we had exhausted, slipping through my fingers like the dry sand of a desert we were forced to cross alone. I stood at the threshold, my feet anchored by the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies and a million memories that threatened to pull me under. The problem wasn't just the silence, it was the way her eyes stayed closed, refusing to acknowledge the world we had built together from nothing but hope and hard work. I sat by her side, the chair creaking under my weight, and I took her hand. It was so small, so translucent, like a fallen leaf at the end of autumn. I leaned in close, my voice a jagged whisper, and began to tell her about the garden, how the peonies were finally blooming, and how the cardinal she loved had returned to the feeder. I spoke of the way the light hit the kitchen table at 7 in the morning, the exact way it did when she used to pour my coffee. Suddenly, her fingers gave a microscopic twitch against mine. Her eyelids fluttered, a slow and painful movement that felt like the breaking of a dawn after a century of night. She didn't speak, she couldn't, but she looked at the watch in my hand and then up at me with a clarity that shattered my heart into 1,000 pieces. In that look, there was no fear, only a profound, overwhelming love that bypassed the need for words. It was a handover of the torch, a silent blessing that told me I was allowed to go on, even when her own light was flickering low. I wept then, my tears falling onto the cool brass of the watch, realizing that while the ticking might eventually stop, the song we had written together would play on in the quiet spaces of my soul forever. I stayed there until the moon climbed high, tethered to her by a silver thread of devotion that refused to snap. As the house settled into a deep, heavy slumber, I noticed the watch had stopped exactly at 12, its hands frozen in a perfect, vertical line. I didn't know then that the morning would bring a discovery in the attic that would change everything I thought I knew about our beginning. The dusty floorboards of the attic did not just creak, they groaned with the weight of 40 years of unspoken apologies. I held the silver locket in my palm, its surface tarnished by time, but still pulsing with the warmth of 1,000 forgotten suns. It was a heavy, rhythmic thrumming against my skin, a heartbeat from a ghost who refused to be laid to rest until the truth was finally whispered into the light. I remember the day Silas brought this home, his hands trembling as he tucked it into the velvet lining of the jewelry box. We were young then, living in that drafty house on the edge of the creek where the willows used to weep into the water. He had worked 3 extra shifts at the mill, his knuckles raw and bleeding from the cold, just to buy a token of a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. I watched him through the kitchen window, a man carved from grit and silent devotion, standing in the rain while the world tried to wash his dreams away. He never told me about the debt he owed or the way the shadows were closing in on our little sanctuary. He simply smiled, kissed my forehead, and told me that as long as the moon rose over the ridge, we would be safe. But the safety was a fragile glass ornament, shattered by a single phone call on a Tuesday night. I found the ledger hidden behind the flour sack, a map of his desperation written in frantic, ink-smudged columns. He had been selling his own heritage, piece by piece, to keep the roof over our heads and the furnace humming through the bitterest winters. Every heirloom, every watch, every gold coin his father had left him was gone, sacrificed on the altar of a quiet life for me. I felt the loss of my innocence in that moment, realizing that my comfort was bought with the slow, agonizing erosion of his own identity. He was fading away so that I could shine. When I confronted him, the silence was louder than any shout. He didn't make excuses. He didn't offer a defense. He just slumped into the wooden chair, his shoulders dropping like a bridge collapsing under too much weight. The tears didn't fall from his eyes. They seemed to leak from his very soul, pooling in the deep lines of a face that had aged 10 years in a single season. I reached out, my fingers tracing the silver of the locket around my neck, and I realized it wasn't a gift of vanity. It was a life raft. He had traded his past to ensure I had a future, and the weight of that sacrifice was a burden I would carry until my own passing from this world. We sat there in the dim light of the kerosene lamp, two broken people held together by the silver thread of a love that was too expensive for this earth. The locket clicks open now, revealing the tiny, faded portrait of the daughter we lost before she could even draw breath. It is a reminder that some treasures are never truly gone, even when the heart stops beating. I close my eyes and wait for the sound of his footsteps on the stairs, knowing that the next secret buried in this room will change everything I thought I knew about our goodbye. The dusty floorboards of the attic do not just creak. They whisper the names of those who have long since departed, a chorus of wooden sighs that only the lonely can truly hear. Somewhere beneath the heavy scent of cedar and mothballs lies a secret that has held its breath for over 50 years, waiting for hands trembling with age to finally set it free. It was a Tuesday when the sunlight hit the corner of the trunk just right, illuminating a tarnished brass lock that looked less like a fastener and more like a period at the end of a very long, painful sentence. Inside that trunk sat a stack of letters, bound not by ribbon, but by a frayed piece of blue yarn from a sweater she used to wear when the world was still colored in shades of hope. I picked up the top envelope, the paper so brittle it felt like the wing of a fallen moth, and saw his handwriting the bold, slanted strokes of a man who promised to return before the harvest. He had written about the way the stars looked from the trenches, describing them as tiny diamonds sewn into a velvet shroud, a beauty that felt like a cruel joke in the face of such darkness. He spoke of the small, silver locket he kept tucked against his heart, the one containing a lock of my hair and a photograph that was surely fading as fast as his strength. The problem wasn't just the distance or the silence that followed his final letter. It was the way the world moved on while I remained frozen in that autumn of 1944. I spent decades wondering if he had thought of me when his soul left his body, if my name was the last thing his lips formed before the quiet took him. I reached the bottom of the trunk and found a smaller, velvet box I had never noticed before, tucked inside the lining. With fingers that felt like stiff winter branches, I pried it open to find that very same silver locket, returned to me through a series of miracles and strangers' hands, its surface scratched and dull, but its hinges still holding true. As I clicked it open, a small, hand-drawn map tumbled out, marking a spot beneath the old willow tree where we had carved our initials into the bark. He hadn't just left me a memory, he had left me a destination, a final promise that even when a passing occurs, love remains anchored to the earth we once walked together. I pressed the cold metal to my cheek, the tears finally breaking through the dam of half a century, tasting of salt and the bittersweet relief of finally being found. The weight that had sat upon my chest for 5 decades didn't vanish, but it shifted, becoming a gentle pressure rather than a crushing burden. I looked out the attic window toward the skeleton of the old willow, its branches reaching out like longing arms toward the darkening horizon. The map in my hand felt like a warm palm pressed against mine, guiding me toward a closure I thought was reserved only for the angels. There is one final task left for these tired bones, a journey of a few hundred yards that feels as long as a lifetime. I will find that tree, and I will finally say the words that the wind has been carrying for all these lonely years. The dusty floorboards of the general store groaned under the weight of a secret kept for 50 years, a silence that tasted like copper and old lace. In the dim light of the setting sun, a single photograph sat atop the counter, its edges curled like a leaf in autumn, waiting for eyes that had long ago forgotten how to weep. The air was heavy with the scent of cedar and the ghosts of promises made before the world learned how to break. Elias ran a trembling hand over the glass of the display case, his fingers tracing the path where his wife's hand used to rest every Saturday morning. They had built this life out of grit and shared dreams. But now the shelves held nothing but shadows and the lingering echo of her laughter. He remembered the day the telegram arrived, the way the paper felt like ice against his skin, delivering news that felt like a loss. He had spent 5 decades trying to outrun the grief, burying it beneath inventory ledgers and the mundane tasks of a shopkeeper, but the heart is a stubborn vault. As he reached into the bottom drawer of the roll-top desk, his knuckles white and stiff with age, he found the small wooden box he had vowed never to open again. Inside lay a pair of tiny, hand-knitted booties, white wool yellowed by time, intended for the son who passed away at birth. The weight of that loss crashed over him in a physical wave, pulling him down to his knees on the cold, hard wood. He clutched those small, soft things to his chest, the yarn still smelling faintly of the lavender she used to keep in her knitting basket. In that quiet corner of a fading world, Elias finally let the dam break, his sobs raw and jagged, echoing off the jars of penny candy and the bolts of calico fabric. He wasn't just crying for the child who never was. He was crying for the woman who had carried that sorrow until her own passing last spring. He realized then that he had been a sentinel for a ghost town, guarding a love that was too vast for any one building to hold. The catharsis was a terrifying, beautiful storm, washing away the decades of practiced stoicism until there was nothing left but the truth of his devotion. He saw her then, in the mind's eye, standing by the grain scale with a soft smile, beckoning him to let go of the pain and remember the light they had shared. As the last of the golden light retreated from the room, Elias felt a strange, cool peace settle over his weary bones for the first time in half a century. He folded the booties back into the box with a gentle reverence, knowing the time for hiding was over. The store felt different now, no longer a tomb but a sanctuary where every creak of the floor told a story of endurance. The shadows in the parlor grew long, stretching like thin, skeletal fingers across the faded Persian rug, but Arthur did not reach for the lamp. He sat in the velvet armchair that still carried the faint, haunting scent of lavender and old books, clutching a silver locket so tightly the metal bit into his palm. It was the only weight left in a world that had become impossibly light and hollow. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 6, each chime a heavy hammer blow against the silence of a house that had once overflowed with laughter and the frantic pitter-patter of Sunday morning breakfasts. He remembered the way Eleanor used to hum while she painted by the window, her brush dancing across the canvas to a melody only she could hear. She had been the color in his grayscale world, the steady heartbeat beneath the chaos of their younger years. Now, the easel stood bare in the corner, draped in a white sheet like a ghost waiting for a command to come back to life. He looked at the dust motes dancing in a single shaft of amber light and realized with a crushing ache that he was waiting too. He was waiting for a footfall on the stairs that would never come, for the kettle to whistle, for the simple, mundane magic of a life shared. He opened the locket, his thumbs trembling as they traced the tiny grain of sand faces captured in the sepia photograph inside. They were so young then, standing on the edge of the pier with the salt spray in their hair, convinced that forever was a promise the universe was obligated to keep. He whispered her name into the stillness, a soft, jagged sound that seemed to shatter the very air around him. The realization that he would never again hear her call him Artie felt like a physical blow to his chest, a sudden loss of oxygen that left him gasping. He pulled her knitted shawl from the back of the chair and pressed it to his face, breathing in the lingering essence of the woman who had been his North Star. In that moment of absolute solitude, the dam finally broke. The tears were not quiet. They were a torrential release of 50 years of devotion, a rhythmic sobbing that echoed off the cold mahogany walls. He realized then that the passing of a loved one isn't a single event, but a million tiny departures every single day. He held the shawl as if it were a life raft, anchoring him to a shore he could no longer see. As the last of the sun dipped below the horizon, Arthur stood up, his legs heavy as lead, and walked toward the hallway. He stopped at the bottom of the staircase, looking up into the darkness where their bedroom waited, cold and cavernous. Just as he turned to leave, a soft, rhythmic tapping started at the front door, echoing through the empty foyer. It was too late for visitors and too deliberate for the wind, a sound that sent a strange, icy shiver racing down his spine. Through these interwoven tales of lost time, hidden secrets, and enduring love, we see that the echoes of the past never truly fade. They live on in the objects we keep and the memories we carry. Like this video if it moved you, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. If these stories touched your heart, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a journey into the attic of memory. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below about a keepsake that holds a special meaning for you.